This is the engine to my Yamaha YZF1000R Thunderace. And it's missing its top end. That's because I have part of it in my hands. These parts look like brand new because they have in fact just been recently vapor blasted. But things are not looking good because, as you can tell, it's got a little bit rusty. Let me give you a quick recap. In the last episode, we were getting ready to start rebuilding this Yamaha Thunderace. However, we got off to a terrible start. After spending a whole weekend trying to remove the stubborn exhaust studs, a piece of my drill bit snapped off in the very last exhaust stud, which was just my luck. This wasn't going to be an easy fix, and so I determined that the way forward was to actually take a couple of steps backwards and completely remove the top end. And so here we are, and with thanks to a subscriber who had this laying around, which meant I no longer had to try and figure out how I was going to remove that broken stud from this piece of the head cylinder. But I am just a little bit disappointed to discover the top end has managed to rust under the cover. However, we won't dwell on that for now, and instead just appreciate this vapor blasted top end, which is spanking and ready for reassembly. And because it was so clean, I also took the time to polish off all the valves by hand by placing them into my power drill, then adding a small amount of oil to a very fine abrasive pad and letting the power drill do all of the work. Right, so we are now going to attempt lapping these valves into the cylinder head. Now if you're curious to know what lapping is, well, it's a procedure that is used to ensure valves seal correctly. So we do this by adding this grinding paste and then grinding each of the valves into each of their assigned ports. As I progress one by one, I also ensure that none of the grinding paste remains in any of the ports. This was a very slow and tedious process, but crucial to ensure the valves make a seal. Once done, I then fit all of the valve seats into place. Then take these new valve seals and make sure they pop as I press them into place. In go the head bolts, making sure to not miss the required washers. Before we proceed to the next stage, a new gasket is required. We find the word up pressed into the gasket to let us know, I guess, which way is up. And just like Lego, we fit part of the block to the other. Now it is time to push each of the valves into their assigned ports. Looking good so far. Up next is a tricky part, and that is reinstalling the valve springs. Using the valve spring compressor, we compress the springs. Why this part is tricky is we need to take these tiny little collets and gently coax them into position. So they look like this when you release a valve spring compressor. I can tell you, this took me quite some time, so I just plugged away. Right, so all of the valve springs are finally in situ, along with those very tricky to install collets. Really time consuming, but I really enjoyed myself. Thoroughly rewarding once you see it all start coming back together again. So let's move on to the next task. And that next task is to take my new vernier calipers and measure the shims. Whilst this one has 200 stamped on it, turns out this comes in slightly under that at 198mm. So I make a note of it. Alright, so we've measured all of the shims underneath each and every one of those buckets, and I've written them down. And as we can see, I don't think any of the shims are actually what they say they measure. The number at the top are what the shims say they measure, and the number just below them are what they actually measure. Now we take each shim, pop them on top of the valve, along with the bucket next. And this was another slow and tricky task, and not all of the buckets went back without a struggle. Okay, another very tedious task, and that was inserting all of these individual buckets into all of these different holes. And it took forever because a lot of them didn't actually go back into their original hole that they came out of, and so I've had to mix up a few of them. It was important that they all went in without a lot of resistance, because the last thing I want, and that is not able to pull that bucket out and replace the shims, which we'll eventually come to in due course. So now this is done, we can continue. So one with the thermostat, then the oil feed lines, and finally the carved inlets. Right then, so the next job is to try and figure out how I remove all of that horrible rust that's built up in those cylinders. Not ideal, still not happy about it, but I think I've got the solution. So we'll make an attempt at making it better. Now my solution was this, and that was to take the abrasive pads I used to clean the valves up, apply a bit of oil, and essentially scrub away at that nasty rust. This was yet again another time-consuming task, but I stayed focused and grafted away to get this right. And this is the result. Check it out. Really chuffed with that. It's all polished up really nicely. No signs of rust anymore. And I've even managed to clean up the tops of the pistons in the process. So we are making great progress with next the head gasket to go on. Then lower the top end down onto the pistons, making sure to pop the timing chain guide into position, setting us up nicely to then torque down the head bolts, which I torque up to 41 Newton meters and work in a crisscross pattern to tighten. I also torque up the oil feed pipes to 20 Newton meters while I'm at it. And now it's next up for the camshafts, one for the inlet and one for the exhaust. This next part is crucial in that I have to ensure these cams are reassembled into the correct position, and that is to set the engine's timing, which is tricky because the proper way to do this is to split the chain, then reattach it with the cams in position, but we are not splitting the chain, so it makes it much more of a challenge. If you look closely, there is an indent on the sprocket to help me. So with the cams in position, I start to tighten down the camshaft clamps. Right, a little bit annoyed because as I've been doing up all of these studs to secure the camshafts into position, I've noticed that whilst this one is in time, this camshaft is now out of time ever so slightly. Great. But it was fine. With a little bit of a tweak, I sorted that. And then reset the timing chain tensioner. And at this point, everything was going so well. We almost had reinstalled all of the camshaft clamps when... So things go from good to bad. We have a snapped bolt. I was literally doing up one of the very last bolts and it's given up on me. It's heartbreaking. And so we end this video on a bit of a downer. You see, I've put somewhat the best part of about 20 hours so far into rebuilding this top end. And at this stage, we are still a million miles away from a complete bike. But I guess nothing worth having ever comes so easy.